Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion, it's not a straightforward review, it's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up with me on Twitter, you can find me at ILTM Podcast. I'm also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, and we have a Patreon. The show is always free, but if you want to support us on there, you can. That's at patreon.com/I Love That Movie, all one word. And if you do join us there, you get a weekly bonus episode of everything else I'm watching. So people ask me about TV shows. We talk about classic film a lot on this podcast. So what about current movies? I talk about it all there on the Patreon. So I do want to take a quick moment to thank my top patrons. They are Chris Balga, Jeff Widman, Philip Barker, and Josh Johnson, a new addition who's been on the show many times and is a close personal friend of mine. And of course, Michael Cross. Thank you guys so much for keeping the lights on. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe and rate this show. It does help new listeners find us. I got a new guest with me here today. I've got Nick Bell. Say hi, Nick.
Hello. It's good to be here, Lisa.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on. So we just chatted a couple weeks ago about ET, and we also chatted about The Wrath of Khan over on Cody's podcast.
Yes,
Yeah.
that podcast is called Video Store Rejects. I've been
Hmm.
a frequent contributor in the past year, mainly as a guest, but I believe I'm going to be a more permanent part of their show. So you can catch me on there.
Yes, and Nick, it's that show is great. You've got such a great crew on there, and I'm happy to hear that you're getting promoted to co-host. That's great.
Yeah, yeah, I surprise.
Yeah. So Nick, I always let our guests choose the movie. So what movie did you choose to talk about today?
Okay, well, today I have chosen LA Confidential, released in 1997, directed by Curtis Hanson, screenplay by Brian Hagelin and Mr. Hanson, and based on the book by James Elroy, part of Mr. Elroy's LA Quartet.
Great. So yes, LA Confidential, 1997. I've watched this a couple of times. Um, Go ahead. It's like you're about to say
Actually,
something.
it's on my list of, I guess, top 10 all-time favorite movies. It's you know what gets should I go into the actual discussion of the movie, or should I throw out some more vital statistics?
Let me read the summary real quick, and then we can totally jump into some statistics because I've got some quick facts as well.
Okay,
Um,
excellent.
oh, and you know what I kind of glossed over? I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself a little bit as well. I know you talked about the podcast, but if you wanted to tell the listeners a little bit about you.
Well, okay, my name's Nick Bell. You can find me at on Twitter at Mr. Afro One, the number one, and mainly on there I just talk about whatever comes to my mind. Usually pop culture. I also, like I said previously, um, I'm also part of a podcast called Video Store Rejects, done with my friend Chris and Cody. Chris, I've known since I lived in East Texas. I am currently based in the DFW area. In in my normal life, quote unquote, I'm a special education teacher.
Oh, that's great.
Yes.
Well, Glad to have you. And I want to let our listeners know before we get started, too much further into this, that there will not be a spoiler wall. I'm just terrible at like remembering to say spoiler wall. So I would recommend pausing this and going and watching the movie if you're worried about spoilers, and then you can come back in and jump in. But here's the summary either way. Uh,
Also, on the
oh, go
same
ahead.
on that same token, it's yeah, spoilers for a 23-year-old movie. If you have not seen it,
And
go
no
watch
shade if you haven't seen it yet, but that's true. You've had time.
it. Yes.
Here's a quick synopsis before we jump in. Three policemen, each with his own motives and obsessions, tackle the corruption surrounding an unsolved murder at a downtown Los Angeles coffee shop in the early 1950s. Detective Lieutenant Exley, the son of a murder detective, is out to avenge his father's killing. The ex partner of Officer White, implicated in a scandal rooted out by Exley, was one of the victims. Sergeant Vincennes feeds classified information to a tabloid magnate, unnamed here, but played by Danny DeVito.
Oh, his character's named Sid Hudgens.
Sid Hudgens, thank you.
Yes.
But yeah, essentially there are three main characters, three or four, and they're all tied up in this, kind of spicy mystery, murder mystery, sort of a neo noir film, I guess. I mean,
Yes.
it's in the '90s, but done in that classic noir style.
Yes, it is very much a modern neo noir film, and that's one of the things that really draws me into it. And one of the things another thing I love about the movie is I am a big stickler of plots that are essentially deconstructions of 1950s nostalgia.
Mm.
Yeah. See, I grew up in the 80s, and back then everyone was like, oh, Elvis, oh, Leave It to Beaver. It was such an innocent time. It's like, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, if you happen to be a woman or black, it kind of sucked. So
Yeah.
I like I like seeing movies that kind of show the 50s as they actually were,
Mhm.
and this is a very LA Confidential is a very big window into that. Um, I believe the original author James Elroy he grew up around a lot of corruption, especially in the LA Police Department, and that's what led him to write those books. Oh yeah, some of which I'll get into in a little bit, but it ties into the motivations of Ed Exley and by Guy Pearce and Russell Crowe, respectively.
Okay. Yeah, I'm with you there, and I think the noir genre is kind of a good genre for that, really, because I mean, it's always about the sort of dark, pulpier, um, you know, criminal element, and along with that usually does come talking about corruption and pulls in a lot of different other social issues of the time. So, especially this one being done in the 90s, I feel like it even more so leaned into some of that and based
Hmm.
on that book like you mentioned. But yeah, I really like this genre a lot. So a lot of the films that I like that are noir films. This was directed by Curtis Hanson,
Yes.
who I we did another episode on one of his movies. I believe we did In Her Shoes. So I think if you go back and look in the archives, you can find another one of his films. But
Oh,
anyway,
nice.
yeah, usually around here I talk about a couple of quick facts, and I know you had a few. So why don't you start us off? You had a couple statistics you wanted to share.
Well, I this actually won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. I mean, usually I said on my other show that I don't really hold the Academy Awards in a very high light, but there are some awards that are worth talking about. And best screenplay, either original or adapted, is I think one of them. And this also won a Best Actress award for Kim Basinger, who played she played a call girl named Lynn Bracken, and
Yeah, she did a good job.
she's dolled up to look like 50s actress Veronica Lake.
That's right, Veronica Lake.
Hmm.
Um, well, that's really cool. Yeah, I think that's a good award. You know, writing, I mean, that does seem like one of the more important aspects of from the award show, so I'm with you there.
Yeah, which is also funny because I'm actually holding. I found this at a half price book about a month ago. The a copy of the shooting script for this movie, and
Oh,
you know,
really?
yeah, it was less than $5. I had to get it.
Yeah, that's a good deal. Another fact that I had was that at the time the film takes place, no building in Los Angeles was allowed to be taller than City Hall, so the cameras were all placed at certain points so that any building taller than City Hall would not be seen.
Ah, trying to get some period accuracy there.
Yeah. And then I
Yeah.
also had that Guy Pearce did not like Ed Exley when he first read the screenplay because he felt the character was overly self-righteous, which I could totally see. I mean, I would argue that neither he nor, well, of the three main characters, Bud White, Jack uh Vincent, I'm just always gonna have a hard time saying that. And Ed
Yeah.
Exley, between the three of them, I feel like they're not supposed to be super good guys. They're kind of like flawed main characters, which is perfect for a noir film.
Well, I kind of disagree with Mr. Pierce because yeah, all of them are very flawed. Like Jack Vincennes, he basically, uh, I would say he was even more of a glory hound than Ed Exley because he
Yes.
shills for basically the '50s equivalent of the National Enquirer.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of like the way that police officers are seen if they were on the show Cops. Like all the other
Mm.
police officers would be like, "Yikes, that's embarrassing." Like I feel
Well,
like Jack was kind of like that because it's like, he's engaging in this celebrity aspect of being a detective, which is kind of
He's also based on Jack Webb.
mm.
For those of you who don't know, Jack Webb is he was also an LAPD cop, but he was also the creator of the radio show and later TV series. It was Dragnet.
Oh, okay. It was based on Dragnet. Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, so Jack Vincennes is based on that character. In fact, there are several times when um, you know he meets up with his fellow cops and they tease him like say go get the facts, just the facts, which was a phrase on Dragnet.
Got it. Oh, okay. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, Lastly, I had that Russell Crowe initially turned down the film as he did not believe he could convincingly play a tough character, which is hard to believe. Like
God.
even Russell Crowe's career, I'm like, what? Must have been
Yeah,
earlier on.
yeah, Russell Crowe is, you know actually, no, knowing what we now know about Russell Crowe, I would say Bud White is a little bit more true to life um than he thought.
Yeah, than he would hope even. But
Yeah.
yeah, I also read that he based his performance on this from on that of Sterling Hayden in Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. Because it's kind of
I'm
like
not
that
familiar with that one.
manliness. Oh yeah, it's really good. But it's basically portraying like the manliness that came out of World War II, or like I guess the machismo from you know having gone through that, and
Yeah.
you can kind of see that in his performance. Oh, you
Yeah.
know what? I have a bonus one because I found so many interesting facts about this movie. I just thought, okay, I've got one more. Lana Turner's private life posed a serious problem for studios. Her 8 marriages were one element, and another element was Johnny Stampanato. The film is set 5 years before Turner's most notorious incident, during which Stampanato attacked her. Turner's daughter stabbed and killed him in defense of her mother. The trial and acquittal provide a great deal of gossip for years to come.
Yeah, and it's almost a small part because yeah, Johnny is he's a minor but significant character in and there's also a scene later on where Ed Exley, um, tries to work her, and he mistakes her for um, for one of the call girls who were made up to look like movie stars, and he says a hooker cut to look like Lana Turner is just a hooker. She just looks like Lana Turner. And Vincennes turns to him and says she is Lana Turner.
Yeah, it's a case of mistaken identity, but also feels like a weird meta commentary on Hollywood in general.
Yeah. Also, another thing, the plot point about prostitutes, call girls made up to look like movie stars, that was an actual thing.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that. I read that in there that there's lots of rumors about that, books written about it, and even some celebrities that say that they engaged or in it or knew about it.
Well, I mean, there's obvious one of the most famous examples I can think of off the top of my head is Charlie Sheen, how he
Mm.
was a frequent client of Heidi Fleiss back in the day.
Mm. Interesting. Well, it makes sense, right? I mean, it's like the world's oldest profession. Sex work is not new,
Yeah,
and it
of
would
course
make
not.
sense to have that alongside of what everything else that was going on at the time. And it just kind of adds a layer to the movie of like, on the outside, there's a picture that's painted of what Hollywood is like, but then there's a real different side to it. And plus, in a lot of noir films, it tends to center on a kind of a seedy cop or a cop that or a detective that's dealing with corruption and tough instances and things like that. And they usually are tied to a woman who's either a femme fatale or she has a sex worker background. So kind of goes right into again the genre that this film is set in.
Yeah, and that's actually where Lynn Bracken's character comes in. Like
Mhm.
she's not quite the femme fatale, but she is part of that bigger picture and doesn't even know about it. Um, there, which also leads to another character, Pierce Patchett, played by David Stratham.
Mhm.
And what I find interesting is how meaningful his name is because his name is Pierce Morehouse Patchett, PMP initials, or if you look at it, PIMP, which is what
Mm,
he does.
interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh, you know what?
So
Another thing I forgot to ask you was how old were you when you first saw this movie? Like, what's your background with it?
actually, I was in college when I first saw this movie. I was living in my first apartment. We had, of course, we had cable, so it happened to be on HBO. And oh, I thought, um, no, this actually looks good. And I caught it in the middle of it, which is, par for the course when you're stick to it. And um, I liked it so much that I ended up buying it on VHS. Excuse me, and added that to the list of my favorite movies. And when I eventually switched to DVD, that was another one of my big purchases. So
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
yeah, I did not see it in the theater, even though I was technically old enough to see it. I was 17, just right for an R-rated movie.
Yeah. I also did not see it when it came out, although I think I would have been, well, I mean, 16 or something. I don't know. No, I was still too, maybe 13, but I was still maybe a little too young to see it. But I've seen it. I think I rented it, but I think it was digitally. Like I think it wasn't. I mean, it was a while ago, but it wasn't like I don't know before you could do it digitally. So I think that's when I first saw it. I guess I got to the party late, unless there's some other instance that I'm thinking of and I can't remember. But I have to say, like rewatching it, I think I really enjoyed rewatching it. It wasn't like seeing it for the first time, but it had been a long time since I'd seen it.
Oh yeah, and actually, that's one thing that a mark of quality that I like to put on movies, their rewatch value,
Hmm.
because there are several bad movies that I can watch over and over again, and there are several great movies that I can only watch once. But this, at the same time, is a great movie, and is a um, you know I can watch over and over again, and uh, even then catch something new.
Yeah. And to kind of return back to what we were talking about a minute ago, I think we're kind of going through the cast list a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the fact that it stars like Guy Pearce. Guy Pearce is one of those guys that I thought he was going to end up being way more famous than he actually is. Do you feel that way? Like, especially like in this film, it's like he's playing such a huge role, but I feel like he never quite took off the way other people like him did. Um,
Yeah, I got that feeling too. I mean, he uh he was Killian in Iron Man 3, and that was the last thing I saw him in, but most of his work I've seen are just uh small independent productions.
Yeah, like Memento's obviously probably the
Hmm.
most famous one and probably the first time I saw him actually. But he's always been around and he's been in some big movies, but he's never quite, I don't know, I used to have a theory that maybe he looked a little too much like Brad Pitt or something back then, that he just never really took off the way you would think. But I always enjoy his performance and I feel like he nails Ed Exley. He's got this quality to him where that character comes across as almost creepy at times in terms of how intense and like nerdy he is, but is still like, I don't know, he just does a really good job with that character and I think it's an interesting performance.
Yeah, see, what I actually liked about Ed Exley is he is by in the beginning of the movie, he is by the book to a fault.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
yeah,
true.
um, he goes up to his police chief, uh, played of played excellently by James Cromwell, and he says, and Smith asks him, "Would you have evidence on a suspect you knew to be guilty in order to ensure an indictment?" And he says, "No." And Smith says, "For the love of God, don't be a detective then." And he says,
Yeah.
I don't need to do this the way you did it or my father did." So he feels like he needs to do the right thing and do it right. But in the end of the movie, he does learn to get his hands a little bit dirty, but he still has a little bit of that integrity because at the end of the movie, he's interrogated by two internal affairs officers, and they ask him, "You think you could talk your way out of this, Lieutenant?" He says, "No, but I think I can tell the truth."
I think he's very optimistically by the book in the beginning. I think he feels like he can change the force from the inside and he's got this belief that he's going to be able to do that and be 100% open and honest. And by the end of it, I think he's a little bit more jaded and realizes that while he can try to do the right thing, he does have to operate within the confines of where he's at. And that, yes, sometimes there are shades of gray and that that's okay.
Yeah, and um, also that kind of goes into different motivations is, and I think that's what brings him and Bud White together, because they each tell stories about how they lost a parent to a criminal that was never caught. Like
Hmm.
Ed Exley, you just made up some name. He called the crook Rolo Tomashi because nobody knew who he was. He just made the name up to give him some personality. And
Hmm.
Bud talks about how his father, chained him to a radiator and beat his mother to death, and you know, and the but they're both of their motivations involve wanting to catch people who think they can get away with it, and
Yeah.
that is something similar that happened to not to James Elroy,
Hmm.
um, someone. Um, Someone who was close to him was murdered in his youth, and the killer was never caught.
Mm. Yeah, it's got to have a lasting traumatic effect. And I think like all three main characters, um, at one point in the story get sort of seduced by the celebrity or by You know what I mean? Just by the notoriety or getting ahead, and then by the end they realize what's most important is the truth and doing the right thing. But they kind of, the movie sort of paints a picture of why it's so easy to get like caught up in things that don't matter. And yeah, I can see what you're saying about Ed Exley. There's something refreshing about him, particularly like even in the first scene, where some Mexican men are brought into the jail, and
Yes,
there's this whole like free for all where it's like, well, they hurt a cop, so we're gonna beat them all up, and he's like, yeah, this isn't good. Like, this is not justice. This is just like, there's no proof, there's no judge, there's no jury. That's not what a police officer is
it's
supposed to be doing. But he's learning like that is what they often do.
yeah, and that's actually what draws me to him as a character because you're right, it was petty vengeance. The background of they they got into a scuffle with some police officers, and they and the police officers, managed to go home with bruises, but all the cops started exaggerating everything, saying,
Hmm.
it's like one cop lost 6 pints of blood and the other one's being read his last rites. So, like, they're trying to justify the massive beating that they're about to give them.
Exactly. Yeah. They're drunk. I mean, like, there's just so many things wrong with that. And so he's kind of a refreshing character. You also already mentioned James Cromwell. It's really nice to see him in this movie. He does a great job as Dudley Smith. Um,
Yes. Yes, he plays a very affable character. Then there's that point point in the movie when he just pulls out a revolver and shoots Jack Vincennes.
yes. Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah,
That
because
was a good scene.
yeah, like it was kind of a big wham moment,
Yeah.
and um, I mean, you you knew from the beginning that Dudley was a little bit dirty, but you didn't know how dirty he was because he was uh he was and earlier on in the movie he was running this, I guess, muscle group where it's Cohen getting arrested and sent to jail, and they are trying to make sure the power vacuum doesn't get filled. And at first, it seems like Dudley Smith is one of those cops. The ends justifies the means. So
Hmm.
the actual reason he's doing that, all of those rackets.
Yeah.
So it's um, James Cromwell can play a very compelling villain,
Yes, I
and
completely
and
agree.
this is the same guy who said that'll do, pig, that'll do.
I know I always think of Babe, or the other movie I think of is First Contact when I think of
Yeah,
him.
Star Trek First Contact.
Yeah. And recently he's been in a show on HBO called Succession a lot. He plays like the brother of like the main mogul in the show that's, really rich, but he's like rejected the family, and he's like the more liberal brother. And it more mirrors kind of how he is in real life.
Well, he actually did a very good stint on 6 Feet Under.
Oh, okay.
Like, yeah, he was Ruth Fisher's love interest in I want to say the last 2 seasons of the show.
Oh, okay. Did not know
Yeah,
that.
and it's a very interesting look into yeah, spoiler alert for that show, but it's a very good look into mental illness.
Okay. Have to check that out. We haven't talked about, there's a little bit of an elephant in the room with this movie, I think, because
Yes, yes. I wasn't sure if you should mention this or should I, but yes, let's get this out of the way.
yeah, so, for listeners that may be a little younger and may have only known Kevin Spacey from House of Cards, you have to understand that for a long time in the 90s, he dominated movies, and was beloved as an actor. So it's incredibly, it's kind of awkward now when you go back and look at some films he was in. because of who he ended up being in real life.
Yeah, it's disheartening because I mean, as terrible as he was, yeah, Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey had some acting chops. He and he was also uh, you know he knew how uh, he knew what was important to the story. He was the villain in Seven, which
Hmm.
really puts that into perspective. But he told the director not to include him in the main cast list because
Oh,
he thought it would be too much of a spoiler. So they compensated him by giving him the very first end credit.
I see. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, he
but
was that just speaks to how famous he was. People would know right away, you know.
yeah,
Yeah.
and uh, actually, it's um, I'm gonna take a small detour
Oh,
for a
go for it.
second. Yeah, there is a TV movie that exists on you. It's on YouTube. I mean, you could probably find it elsewhere. I mainly found it on YouTube, where Kevin Spacey plays televangelist Jim Baker. Now,
Mm.
for those of you listeners who don't know, Jim Baker was a very big televangelist in the '80s. Basically he used church funds to um, as his own personal piggy bank, and he had affairs. In the very first 6 minutes of that movie is probably the most unintentionally hilarious moment about that movie because he just had because Kevin Spacey as Jim Baker had this affair. So he goes to his home church and prays for forgiveness, and he's down on his oh Lord Jesus, I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. It is it is probably one of my favorite moments in made for TV hell.
Oh gosh.
Uh I I as far as disgraced figures go, I will still acknowledge that whether or not I like the work,
Hmm.
but I will hesitate to say that, you know,
That
this
they're
this
missed
was
or we need them or something. Yeah.
yeah, they were a bad person. I will not hesitate to say that he was a bad person.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments in college was my we were talking about um, late 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century music history, and we were talking about Wagner's operas, and my music history called him the world's first Nazi.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, but well, mainly because Wagner was very anti-Semitic. He
Ugh.
wrote this huge diatribe
Yuck.
that blames his lack of initial success in German opera on the fact that a lot of opera houses were owned by Jewish people. He called it Jewishness in music. It was bad.
Yeah. I mean, and around that time, I mean, it's honestly not that surprising, but
Well,
anyway,
yeah.
that's a whole nother discussion, but
Oh,
that's
yeah.
pretty yeah,
But
that's I
it's
understand that. But as the further we get away from it, the more we don't think about that. So that's interesting to know.
Yeah, and I think, and yeah, you are right. People do tend to um, put performers on
They
pedestals
do,
to the point.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look no further than R. Kelly. I mean,
Yeah.
personally, I I did not really liked his music. The um, I mean, all of the accusations just drove that even further home. But even so, yeah, I am very um, quick. I will be very quick to admit that while this person's work is great, they are not good people.
Yeah, yeah. But oh well, I guess I mean he's got some demons in his closet of a different type, but we've also got Russell Crowe, who we mentioned actually probably is the perfect person to play Bud White, considering some
Yes,
of the
yes,
antics he's been into. But Yeah, also a great actor, and very popular around this time. I don't know when beautiful was that A Beautiful Mind came out, but I feel like it was around then. Oh,
I want to say,
2001. Okay.
yeah, Beautiful Mind was like a few years away. This was when Russell Crowe's star was just about to blow up.
Okay. Yeah, when was Gladiator?
I want to say that was 2002.
Okay. So that's
That's
why I
off
was
the
like,
top
him
of my
saying
head.
that he wasn't tough enough. I'm like, but what about that movie Gladiator? That's like what he's known for. But maybe this is the start to that, to him being seen as
I
a
would
tough
say
guy.
this is very much the start to that. I remember a long time ago, he there was in talks for him to play Wolverine before Hugh Jackman was
I
cast.
could have seen that, honestly. I mean, he's one of the
I
few I could have
definitely
seen
could
that.
have.
Yeah. Um, and then we've also got, you mentioned earlier, Kim Basinger, who I feel like was so freaking famous and then kind of fell off the map.
Yeah, there was this incident a few years prior. She was set to star in this movie called Boxing Helena,
Hmm.
and she ended up reading the script and saw that the movie was terrible and super misogynistic. So she backed out, and the studio sued her, and she lost.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but and then they ended up casting someone else. But yeah, the even without Kim Basinger, I've seen most of that movie, and I can tell you it's a dumpster fire.
Oh gosh. Well, it sounds like it. But I think it also speaks to the fact that she's from a time in Hollywood when women sort of had a shelf life. I feel like we're starting to finally get away from that. But I also feel like,
Yes.
when I talk about women in movies, a lot of times I'm talking about the men with these long careers, and then the women don't really have that. They're always looking for a new bombshell, a new, young blonde woman, and specifically blonde at this time. But anyway, that's another discussion. But I'm glad that we're moving away from that, but I do feel like she was affected by it. And it sounds like her reputation was affected by her standing up and not wanting to be in a project.
It I would say it was, but like I said, that she acted in this and did win an Oscar, but it seems that she's disappeared from the public eye. The only thing, well, this was only a few years ago, and so that might have changed. The last thing I saw her in was 8 Mile.
Yeah, and that was a long time ago too now.
Hmm. So I think she's more wanting to live a more private
Well,
life.
that makes sense. I mean, and she's definitely, that's her choice. We kind of forget that. I'm sure it's a lot to put up with, being in the public eye. So,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and then I think we should talk about Danny DeVito a little bit too, who plays Sid Hudgens. I really like his character in this movie. I feel almost like, I mean, he's kind of playing a character that he plays a lot, but his voice is so perfect for
Well,
this
yeah,
journalist. It's just great.
yeah. Well, Danny DeVito was to me was one of those perfect castings because he can play the right kind of sleazy. I mean,
Yes.
I, uh, it's like look at Matilda.
Yeah. And it's like he's sleazy, but it's not like a Joe Pesci sleazy where it's like, Goodfellas, like violent
Or
sleazy. He's just kind
yeah,
of sleazy but lovable.
yeah. He's a muckraker
Yeah.
basically, and also kind of um, well, kind of um, a accomplice to entrapment
Yes.
because in the his introduction scene is where he said, "Oh, a friend of mine sold weed to this small time actor. I'll pay you this much money to bust him."
Yeah, it also, I think, is paying an homage to the fact that the journalist used to have like desks in the police department, which is super ridiculous. It's an
Yeah.
obvious conflict of interest. Now, that's not what he's got going on. It's at least more, underground than that. But that just kind of tells you that there's always sort of been a relationship with the police departments and the press. And I think in
Yeah.
this movie, they're really highlighting there's problematic elements to it, although Danny DeVito's character ends up being a pretty integral part of catching the bad guy.
Oh yeah, yeah. Uh, well, actually, turns out, Danny DeVito's character, he was in on it too, and
Yeah.
at the end, Smith starts killing everybody um, who he was cooperating with, so he could just seize power all by himself.
Yes. So this kind of leads me into the next section. You've talked a little about the director, about some of the actors, but I want to hear some of your favorite scenes from the movie.
Oh God, that is well, I would say, um, again, it was the end where um, okay, here's a little bit of the setup. Um, Exley, buying Exley and Bud has had a shootout with all the other cops,
Yeah.
and Smith says, are you going to shoot me or arrest me?" And there's no real audible answer, but he puts his gun away and he says, "Good man." And as he walks out, Exley shoots him in the back, which is a callback to something Smith asked him earlier. Would you be willing to shoot a hardened criminal in the back in order to
Mm,
offset the chance that some lawyer? And this is what I'm actually holding the screenplay right now.
that's
And
such a good way to tie it up too.
yeah, it says, here's the stage direction. Exley's shotgun belches flame. Dudley goes down, shot in the back. Exley's answer is finally yes. As police cars come over the hill, their flashlights illuminating Dudley's body with Exley standing over him. Exley drops the shotgun and holds his own badge above his head.
Nice.
And the scene in question is when he's being interrogated, and he's basically laying everything out on the table.
Hmm.
And it's really, first of all, it's one of my favorite actor monologues from one of my favorite monologues from Guy Pearce. And he lays everything out on the table, and the DA's watching him, the police chief's watching him. This comes out, they're like, "Oh man, what are we going to do about this? This is going to stay in the department for decades." And they say, "Well, who's to say what happened
Yeah.
if we can get to play ball?" And then he's just smiling through the two-way mirror, and they ask us like, "So what are you smiling about?" Says, "I'm just thinking about what you're going to be doing." And everyone else is surprised except because they know that actually at playing angles. Like, even though the corruption has been rooted out, there's still some of it lingering,
Yeah.
and that's one of my favorite scenes in that whole movie.
Yeah. It's a good one. Um, a couple for me. I really like the introduction that we get to Kim Basinger's character because I feel like it's a really, really perfect callback to a classic noir film. You know, the
Hmm.
outfit she's wearing, we see her from the back and then profile and then her introduction to White. And then how that plays into the plot later. That's the part where she seems like she could potentially be a femme fatale later. She won't be, like you said, but I like that scene because I feel like it's just shot well and it's interesting.
Yeah, which is even more interesting because in the original book, Lynn Bracken is even more of a red herring.
Mm,
There's one character who actually had a bigger part, and that was the rape victim, Inez Soto,
mm.
and she was actually gonna in the book. She's actually part of that love triangle between her, Exley, and White.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, yeah, but that was the choice of the screenwriter. But yeah, I there's and the screenplay, there are some stills from the movie, and yeah, here's Kim Basinger in this long black cloak with white trim, just um, sh- um, hiding everything except her face.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really interesting and mysterious and just reminds me a lot of when you first see the female protagonist in noir films.
Yeah.
What's another good scene that you like?
Oh, let's see. Another good scene. Um, wow, that's
I know it's hard.
sorry. Yeah, I know. I know. It's like in. Uh, let's just say one of the interrogation scenes where there are these three black kids who are suspected of shooting up the coffee shop. Uh, Turns out they didn't do it, but they did do something else. That like
Mhm.
they basically kidnapped that one Mexican, raped her, but um, also I just like how he's grilling all of them, and um, he leaves one of those guys, and he turns around and says, "You know, I'm talking about the gas chamber, and you haven't even asked me what this is about. You've
Yeah.
got a great big guilty sign wrapped around your neck."
Ugh, yeah.
And all the rooms, all the cops in that room start to have a little bit more respect for him because they see him at first they see him as this brown nose, but um, it shows Exley's kind of a master interrogator.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like there's a lot of kind of toxic masculinity stuff going on in the department, right? Like they want him to not even wear his glasses, like not even
Hmm.
indicate. It's all about appearance. They want him to throw out his glasses because that will make him look quote unquote weak. But it's like where he isn't physically strong, he's mentally strong. So he's a good detective, and he's kind of proving a point that being a detective isn't just about brute strength, and even the interrogation or intimidation is not always about brute strength. So he's kind of establishing that among the force by using his wits to get a confession.
Yeah, which actually um, leads me to Bud's character
Hmm.
and his overall arc, because he's been thought of as being the brute strength guy, and you could tell he's starting to get tired of that label,
Yeah.
but he has a more um, and you throughout later on throughout the movie you see um, he has some detective skills too, because when he is identifying a body, there his mind kind of flashes back to earlier, because to where he recognizes someone.
Hmm.
And I thought that was a very good um, uh, trick among the film a technique among the filmmakers to do that. And uh, he he actually is he actually can be a very competent detective if they gave him a chance. But it's the 1950s, and everybody has to stick to their roles.
Right. I also feel that Smith manipulates the three main detectives by using their ego against them, to cover his tracks. He sort of stokes the jealousy that Guy Pearce's character has towards Russell Crowe's character. He wanted him at one point, Russell Crowe, to kill him by, manipulating Guy Pearce into like being seduced by Kim Basinger's character. Like everything he does is
Yeah,
sort of moving chess pieces in the background to get to use their strengths against them. And like another or like and so White, he's often used as the muscle throughout the film, and people sort of downplay his intelligence. He's the perfect person for Smith to send in to beat people up or potentially kill them, and do what he wants. All he has to do is sort of stoke his rage.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it really comes together when um, they bring when Exley and White start working together, which is another of my favorite
Oh
scenes
yeah.
of that one exchange that says, where White says, why are you doing this? The night owl made you. You want to tear all that down?" And Exley replies, "With a wrecking ball. You want to help me swing it?"
Yeah, yeah, it's a good moment of growth for both characters. They've both been squaring off this whole movie. Then they have this love triangle with a girl, which when I said nods to something kind of creepy earlier, I feel like Guy Pearce is so intense in the scene with Kim Basinger where he comes on to her and
I think he's kind of acting a little bit because I remember reading somewhere that Exley kind of had a crush on Veronica Lake.
Oh, I like that. Oh, and I think he's playing the character perfectly. Like, but I just think it's like it's
Mm.
so intense. And but there's also this undercurrent that I felt like in that scene where I'm like, I almost feel like he's got this energy towards White where he like, I don't know, hates him so much he loves him kind of thing too. So there I just feel like there are a lot
Oh
of layers
yes,
to that. But I was like at some points I'm like, when is he gonna kiss him? Because I feel like there's some tension here that they're not really talking about. But anyway, that was just in a more modern take, I think they might have explored that. But I noticed that in some of the scenes with them.
uh,
They're just intense.
but yeah, what one of the scenes that I like is basically when they're working together and they realize the DA's been blackmailed,
Yes.
and and
Oh my
then
gosh, that's a great scene.
they realize, yeah, they realize, you know, um, it's like they're kind of acting a role in working together, the whole good cop bad cop thing.
Yes.
And what gets me is like White is just wailing the crap out of the DA, and he says, "I know you think you're the A number one hotshot, but here's the juice. If I take you out, 10 more lawyers will take your place tomorrow. They just won't come on the bus, that's all."
Yeah, because he had made that really uncool comment about, you know, there's another one of you
uh,
that'll come on the bus or whatever. It was
yeah,
really
yeah.
derogatory, and so he throws that back in his face, like, okay, they won't be on the bus, but that still doesn't mean you matter that much.
Yeah, that's kind of, and I like the fact that it kind of uh takes that DA down a couple pegs
Yes.
because it's in it. Well, the reason that they were investigating because there was a that actor who was busted for having pot in earlier on in the movie. He was set up to seduce the DA because uh, the DA's pretty much deep in the closet, as are like almost 90 to 99% of gay men in the 50s.
Exactly, yeah, and, that's another interesting thing about, Kevin Spacey's character, Vicennes, is he recognizes that, how messed up that is, like, it's not just okay for these sex workers, to get killed or for people to be humiliated, or over people being humiliated, a lot
Yeah,
of powerful men don't want people to know that they're with these sex workers, and then that can cause sex workers to go missing. And in the case of the young actor, they were trying to set up the DA, but they didn't realize the fact that he wanted to protect his reputation so much he would kill him. And he's like, nobody deserves that, which is like a really compassionate thing for a straight guy in the 50s to acknowledge. So they want
yeah, that
to
was
pay back what he did, and so yeah.
yeah. I do like that part. And he says, "Yeah, there's a case your guys in homicide don't care about. They think it's just another Hollywood homicide."
Yeah, yeah. Well, and because it does highlight the fact that that happens a lot. I mean, I would even argue, um, to this day, where certain cases are elevated depending on who the victim is. And if you're truly passionate about justice and finding the truth, you wouldn't be elevating certain cases above others, but treating every missing person like they matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Which goes back to my love of 1950s deconstruction
Hmm.
because, of course, obviously, back in the 50s, this was I mean, I guess in behind the scenes, it was something of a public secret,
Yeah.
but now, um, but it really didn't get out to John in uh, Marshall, Texas, or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I agree. I like that aspect of this movie.
yeah, and it's also because it goes back to what Sid Hutchins said in the very start in the opening narration. They're selling an image,
Mhm.
and that's, I think, when it comes to 50s nostalgia, the image is really what they is what people idolize.
Yes.
Because um, most of them actually were either children back in the 50s, and um, I say most nostalgia from that time really comes from the fact that you were living in a time when you really didn't have to worry about paying bills.
Yeah. And also I think it was right after World War II, and a lot of media representation is very overly cheerful, and like there's lots of musicals and stuff because people were like, they'd been through a lot and they kind of wanted to see some lightness. And I think the further we get away from the 50s, we start to mistake what we see in Hollywood for what was actually happening. And this movie is
Exactly.
examining, like, okay, yes, on TV it seemed like everything was great or whatever, but in reality, like, people don't change necessarily. Like, there were social problems then, and probably even more social problems than now. But they
Yeah.
were present, ever present.
Yeah, even in states like California. I mean, California wasn't one of the big Jim Crow states, but the racism definitely was there.
Yeah, I
And
think this movie does a
going
good
back to
job
the
to show how subtle it can be and how intertwined with, I mean, may not be a popular thing to say among some people, but how intertwined with the PD it was.
Yeah, yeah, which um which is another elephant in the room we kind of need to address, because yeah, the I mean, police corruption hasn't gone away. I
Right.
mean, sometimes one of my favorite moments is that uh, in real life is goes back to 2 years ago, when there's this moment where people were the calling city hall. They were doing a Zoom meeting, and people were just calling them and just berating the police because they were gassing peaceful protesters, because this was during the George Floyd protests of
Yeah.
2 years ago. They were gassing police protesters. They were shooting them with rubber bullets. They were arresting. They were arresting the press, while they were being filmed. I mean, there was a moment where a CNN reporter was being arrested in I want to say it was Milwaukee. I don't. Yeah, if anyone's watching and I got the city wrong, just don't be too hard on me. But there's a CNN reporter who was arrested on air while he was reporting by the police, which really shows to yes, this is police corruption is still actually a thing.
Yeah, and being more concerned about press than they are about justice, because if you're literally arresting the press, it's like, or
Yeah,
just reporting what's happening, it's like, come on. But yeah, I think this movie has like several pivotal scenes where they're sort of addressing that, but they're not like coming right out and saying it. It's just sort of in the background a little bit, like with White's former partner, who he later finds out is killed for specific reasons for being involved with things. But I think he saw him as like, a partner that he really cared about and liked. But we get a little foreshadowing in the beginning with the way his partner rushes in to like beat up the Mexican uh you know uh people that have been arrested. So
yeah,
it's like we got
yeah,
that,
exactly.
and White doesn't really necessarily rush in to beat them up, but he does it because he's defending his partner. And then later he's like, he comes to realization like, okay, he was my partner and I felt like I really knew him and I overlooked some stuff, but now I really see who that guy actually was, you know.
Yes,
um and
yes,
then I think, like you said, there's that interrogation scene with the three um younger, well, actually the biggest scene I think where there's like a kind of a highlight is whenever Guy Pearce shoots that guy in the elevator and he later finds out he wasn't the right person.
yes,
That's like a case of getting really emotional in the moment, going after somebody because of a perception, and then killing them, and then later realizing that he was mistaken. You can't just run around. I mean, you should not run around in being an executioner, because there needs to be rules in place, and he actually broke his own
yeah,
rules in that moment, kind of chasing glory. You know, he wanted to be the one that took care of that
yeah,
person.
yeah, exactly. And even when later on in the movie, he kind of realizes that the police chief was behind it. It says, yeah, the chief framed them because they use the old school term Negroes.
Yeah.
Like they framed them because they were Negroes and they had records, and he knew there'd be no questions asked if they were killed resisting arrest.
Yep. I mean, it's not really subtle in the film, but I think
Yeah,
it's like it's still kind of woven in such a way where you don't. It's not the main forefront of the film, but again, they're
no,
commenting on several different aspects of corruption around that time, and like you said, unfortunately, I think there's still some things that have not changed today, but makes
oh, definitely not.
yeah, it's like I did notice that a lot this time. I think I probably noticed that aspect even more because of the last few years. But yeah, that was a good scene too. Um and also the victim that was like, "Oh, no one would have cared because she was Mexican." And so she went along
Yeah,
telling a lie because she wanted some semblance of justice.
yeah. There is a lot of that,
Yeah, there's a lot of layers, I feel like.
and
Yeah.
also, but White's own sense of justice involves uh, punish like beating up on women beaters. So I mean, you don't feel bad because they're beating up on women, and then you find out that his main motivation, and it kind of comes down to retroactive revenge.
Yes, and but also I think what's interesting is the movie touches on how there's a cyclical nature to that in some aspects, because later when he gets really angry at his girlfriend, he goes and hits her. And I think in that moment
Yes.
he realizes, you know, he's seen himself as this hero for using violence to sort of enact revenge, but then in this moment it comes back to haunt him because that's his
He
go-to way to deal with things, and then he's almost becoming his father in that moment.
Yeah, he has officially become what he hates.
Yeah, which I think is like, wow, I don't think I've ever seen a movie explore it that way. So I thought this time I was like, wow, even that's like kind of progressive for this movie.
Yeah, let's see. Actually, there is another point that the screenplay makes. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Uh, this was yeah, it was Lynn, the Veronica Lake sex worker. He says, Bud backhands her hard. Lynn faces straight into the next one as Bud hits her again. The third time takes her down as the sins of the father are visited on the son. Bud stops short as the self realization slams home. She doesn't start crying till Bud turns away and runs away into the rain.
Yes, and I feel like the rain, especially when he walked in and it was raining, I felt like, I don't know, like they were hiding his tears, or like an example of how he's feeling in the moment. You know how sometimes weather is used to kind of
Mm-hmm.
portray that. I thought that was really a good choice too. But yeah, he runs away and you notice like he doesn't go back to apologize to her. He kind of has like a sort of to kind of make up for what he did. He kind of has you know, Guy Pearce's character do that.
Yeah.
Like he's
Um,
kind of like a full circle moment of like acknowledging that he was not the bad guy. And
yeah.
even though what he did was bad, I think part of him trying to make peace was like, okay, I'm going to send specifically the guy that I was upset that you were with to go talk to you because I feel like he's the better person to talk to right now based on what I did. Ed Exley. Was,
Yeah. I would say I would agree with you on that aspect. I don't think he sent him. Well, yeah, he says subtly, yeah, you go talk to her because, but
and he's
yeah,
like, I'm going to go do what I do, beat people up. Like, I'm better at
yeah,
that.
but yeah, he is in a bit of self-loathing because, again, he has become that which he hates.
Yeah. And I think it kind of, it's interesting too because it's easy to just sort of see his dad from only one angle as somebody that abused his mother and killed her,
Yeah,
but that he got there somehow, right? So it's like he's seeing that like he could potentially go down this exact same path. It doesn't start out that way; it ends up that way, and I think it makes a good point about how like with violence, it's not like I think our society sort of acts like there's good and bad violence, but I feel like the film is sort of saying like there's really not. I mean, if your go-to solution is violence, it ends up being a bad thing because it will continue to be your solution.
yeah, it's I'm a believer that violence can be used for good, but this is very much one of those when all you have is a hammer kind of
Yes, yeah,
situations.
definitely. Well, were there other big scenes from this film that we haven't discussed that yet that you wanted to touch on?
Pretty much uh s- I think I pretty much mentioned all my favorite scenes in this, um and really just reading the screenplay and how I don't have you ever read screenplays before?
I own a couple screenplays, but if I'm honest, I don't think I've ever sat down and read through all of them.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what they write on this page um some often doesn't really make it into the finished film, but what gets me about this screenplay is that a lot of what they kept a lot of what was written, which is you know, you know, kind of sort of a minor miracle in and of itself. Like this, the
Hmm.
entire story itself is pretty strong, and eventually, I'm gonna read James Elroy's original book, but I got so many other books that I need to get through
Oh
right
man,
now.
we all have so many we have to get through, so I totally understand.
Yeah.
Um, well, I guess that brings me to my last couple of questions. So I always kind of wrap up with two big questions. One is going to feel a little redundant. You've spent this whole time explaining to me why you love this movie, but if you could summarize it, why do you love this movie so much? Why have you seen it so many
It,
times?
it's a strong story that is well acted, not just well acted, masterfully acted. Like every single person who was on that movie, from directors to screenwriters to cast to production design, everyone in there showed up, came to play, gave 110%, and left every shred of it on the field, which is now why I hope this is one of those movies that will stand the test of time.
Yes. And if you had to pitch this to someone that has never seen the movie before, what would you tell them about it?
Hmm. This is a detective story set in the real 1950s, not the fake 1950s that you see in those old school noir films.
That's true. There's definitely more social issues that are dealt with in this film than in a traditional noir film because it is made in the 90s versus being made in the 50s. So
Yeah,
it's
in the 50s you had the Hays Code.
yeah. Yeah. So it's like I agree with you. That's a really good way to sell it. I have always been a fan of detective stories. I've always been a fan of like true crime as well. And I think this is a great film that is on a lot of lists. I mean, it's on your top 10, right? And I think it's on a lot of
Hmm.
lists for a good reason because it is one of the better, more modern, although now I guess people would think of it as retro noir
Well,
films,
yeah,
but it's a good one and shouldn't be overlooked.
and it's also funny because there's another one of my favorites that's kind of on my list because of deconstruction of 50s nostalgia, and that's Pleasantville.
Oh, I love that movie. A friend recently reached out to me. Actually, just reminding me I need to reach out to her. She wanted to talk about that film, so we should do that one pretty soon. I love that movie.
I love that movie too. Get me in on that because that's another movie I will talk on and on and on about.
Oh my gosh, yes. Well, speaking of that, we do have to have you back. So, um, thank you so much for coming on. Nick, where can people find you?
Well, right now you can find me on Twitter. Again, my handle is Mr. Afro One, the number one, and it's all one word together. And also, I'm part of the Video Store Rejects group. You can find us on Facebook. Right now, we're doing a uh, series which is a retrospective of the movies of 1982 because all those movies have reached their 40th anniversary, and 1982 was a landmark year for science fiction and fantasy. I mean, we talked about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. We talked about E.T. We talked about Poltergeist. Um, I believe Tron and Beastmaster will be next on our list. And also, we'll eventually talk about Blade Runner because,
Nice.
yeah, you want to talk about noir movies. That is that is a futuristic noir.
Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite films ever. But yes, go listen to that show, and thank you, Nick, so much. Hope to have you back soon.
I hope to be back soon. It's really great to have you. Thank you very much, Lisa.